on the edge of the runway. The desert, they said, had a way of erasing time. I used to think that was just poetic nonsense until I stepped foot in North Africa during the war. Out here, under an endless sky and the unrelenting sun, days bled into each other, and the sand swallowed every trace of yesterday. It wasn't the kind of place a man like me, just a small-town kid from Indiana with grease under his nails, ever thought he'd end up. But there I was, crouched on the edge of a makeshift airfield, patching up planes under the kind of pressure that turned your bones to glass. The first thing you learned in this job was to work fast. A plane came in hot, engines rattling like they might fall clean off, and you had minutes, sometimes seconds, to get it back into fighting shape. No one cared if you were tired, hungry, or scared out of your mind. The pilots would step out, their faces pale beneath the grime, and look at you with eyes that said, "Don't let me die tomorrow." And you'd nod, wipe the sweat off your forehead, and dive into the guts of the machine like you were a surgeon in a field hospital. Only the patients here were metallic beasts, and their survival meant the survival of the men who flew them. That was my life, Roy Evans, aircraft technician, doing my part to keep the war machine running. But if you think this is going to be some kind of glory story, you're dead wrong. The war didn't feel like glory when you were on the ground. It felt like chaos, like futility, like trying to hold back an avalanche with a shovel. And yet, amidst all that madness, there were moments, fleeting, fragile moments, that made you believe you were part of something bigger than yourself. I remember one day, just after dawn, the light had that strange, almost holy quality it sometimes gets in the desert, and the air was still cool enough that you could forget, just for a moment, how hot it would get later. We'd been working all night, me, Charlie, and a couple of new guys whose names I didn't even know yet. The Germans had strafed the field again, and half our planes were grounded. My hands were black with oil and shaking from too much coffee and too little sleep, but I didn't stop. None of us did. Then this pilot, I think his name was Lieutenant Carter, came limping back to base in a P-40 that looked like it shouldn't have been able to stay in the air. The fuselage was riddled with bullet holes, one of the wheels wouldn't come down, and there was smoke trailing from the engine. When he landed, the plane skidded halfway off the runway, kicking up a cloud of sand so thick I couldn't see for a minute. But he made it. Somehow he made it. I ran to the plane, my toolkit clanging against my leg, and when I got to the cockpit, Carter was just sitting there, staring straight ahead. He didn't even flinch when I climbed up on the wing and started prying the canopy open. When I finally got him out, he looked at me and said, "She got me home, Roy." Can you believe that? She got me home. That's the thing about these planes. They had a soul. I don't care what anyone says. You could feel it when you worked on them, like they were alive in some way that didn't make sense but also made perfect sense. And maybe that's why it hurt so much when they didn't come back. There was one plane, B-25, we called Lucky 7. She wasn't anything special, just another workhorse of the sky, but she had this reputation for coming through when it counted. The crew loved her, swore up and down she'd saved their skins more times than they could count. And then one day, she didn't come back. No one said anything when the sun went down and the runway stayed empty, but you could feel it, a weight settling over the camp like a storm cloud. The next morning, they found her. She'd crashed somewhere out in the desert, just a pile of twisted metal and burnt sand. I didn't go out to see her. I couldn't. But I heard the stories, how they'd found the crew's dog tags scattered in the wreckage, how the cockpit was mangled beyond recognition. And I thought about how many hours I'd spend under her wings, tightening bolts and patching up bullet holes, and I felt like I'd lost a friend. That was the war for us, the guys who stayed on the ground. We didn't pull the triggers or drop the bombs, but we carried the weight of every plane that didn't make it back. And sometimes late at night, when the desert was quiet and the stars were so bright it hurt to look at them, I wonder if we were really making a difference, if all the sweat and blood and broken knuckles were worth it. But then I'd think about Carter, sitting in that battered P-40 with smoke in the air and death on his heels, and I'd remember the look in his eyes when he said, "She got me home." And I'd tell myself, maybe that was enough. Maybe just getting them home was enough. The desert has a strange way of keeping secrets, but it also has a way of making you feel like it's watching. Every morning, as the first light broke over the dunes, I'd feel it, the weight of the land pressing down on me, like it knew things I didn't. Maybe that's why I wasn't entirely surprised when Charlie started talking about ghosts. Charlie was my partner in this madness, a wiry guy from New Jersey who could fix just about anything with a wrench and a little swearing. He had this way of laughing at everything, even the stuff that wasn't funny, which I guess was his way of coping. But one night, when the laughter was long gone and we were both sitting on an overturned crate, eating cold rations under the faint hum of a generator, he turned to me and said, "Roy, you ever think about what happens to them? You know, the ones that don't come back." At first, I thought he meant the planes. We all thought about them, how their remains were scattered across Europe, the Pacific, the desert here in North Africa. But then Charlie's voice dropped, and he said, "I mean the guys, Roy. The pilots. The crews. You think they just go? Or you think maybe some part of them sticks around?" I didn't know what to say. I mean, who did? The war had a way of making you believe in things you never thought possible. So I just shrugged and muttered something about hoping they found peace. But Charlie wasn't done. "There's a reason they don't like us working on the planes at night," he said, his voice low and serious in a way I wasn't used to. "I've heard guys say they've seen things. Shadows, voices. One guy swears he saw his buddy walking around the field a week after he went down over Sicily. I laughed it off, told him he'd been working too hard and needed sleep. But the truth was, I'd felt it too, that creeping sense that we weren't alone out there. It wasn't just the exhaustion or the constant threat of air raids. It was something else, something I couldn't put into words. And as the days wore on, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit. One night, not long after our conversation, I found myself alone on the edge of the runway. Charlie had turned in early, and the rest of the crew was scattered around the camp, playing cards or writing letters home. I was working on one of the P-40s, trying to get the hydraulics in order before the morning sortie. The desert was quiet. Too quiet now that I think about it. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And that's when I heard it, a faint metallic sound, like someone tapping on the fuselage of a plane. I froze, my wrench halfway to the ground, and listened. It came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the kind of noise you could mistake for the wind or a loose part. It was deliberate, purposeful, like someone was trying to get my attention. "Charlie!" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. I set the wrench down and stepped around the side of the plane, my heart pounding harder than it had any right to. There was nothing there. Just the empty airfield stretching out into the darkness, the faint outlines of other planes silhouetted against the starlit sky. And then I saw it, a shadow moving between the planes. It was quick, almost too quick to catch, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I grabbed a flashlight from my toolbox and swung the beam toward where I'd seen the movement. The light swept across the tarmac, illuminating nothing but sand and steel. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just out of sight. I told myself I was being stupid, that Charlie's ghost stories had got into my head. But as I turned back to the P-40, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the wing, just above where I'd been working, were 3 perfectly clear handprints in the dust. They weren't mine. I'd been wearing gloves all night. And they weren't Charlie's either. These prints were smaller, more delicate, like they belonged to someone who had no business being out here. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up in the maintenance tent, pretending to go over schematics, but really just trying to make sense of what I'd seen. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, maybe, or my own overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew better. Over the next few weeks, more things started happening. Tools went missing and then turned up in places no one remembered leaving them. Engines we hadn't touched would suddenly sputter to life for a few seconds before falling silent again. And then there were the voices, faint and distant, like someone calling out from the far side of the airfield. Sometimes they sounded like Charlie. Sometimes they didn't sound like anyone I knew. I tried to ignore it to focus on the work. But the desert had other plans. One evening, just before sunset, we got word that a squadron of bombers was returning from a mission over Tunisia. They were late, too late, and by the time we heard the first faint roar of engines, we were all on edge. When the planes finally came into view, we knew something was wrong. One of them, a B-25, was trailing smoke, its movements erratic and uneven. It barely made the landing, skidding to a halt at the far end of the runway. We rushed to it, our boots kicking up clouds of dust. But when we reached the plane, it was empty. No crew. No bodies. Just a ghostly, battered shell sitting silently under the desert sky. The empty B-25 sat at the far end of the runway, like some kind of monument to all the things we didn't understand. The smoke from its damaged engine curled lazily into the air, dissolving into the twilight. No one moved for what felt like a lifetime. It wasn't just confusion. It was fear, thick and heavy, like the heat of the desert pressing down on us. Finally, Charlie broke the silence. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, his voice barely louder than the faint hiss of the cooling engine. "Where's the crew? They can't just disappear." But they had. The hatches were closed, the cockpit empty. No sign of blood, no signs of a fight. Just empty seats and silence. It was as if the plane had flown itself back to us. I forced myself to step closer, my boots crunching on the gravel. The smell of burned oil and scorched metal filled my nostrils, and my stomach churned. I climbed onto the wing and peered into the cockpit. The controls were sticky with soot, and the pilot's seatbelt hung loose, unbuckled. I reached for the radio, half expecting to hear static or a ghostly voice crackling through the speaker, but it was dead. "Roy." Charlie's shout snapped me out of my daze. He was standing near the nose of the plane, his face pale and his hands shaking. "You need to see this." I climbed down and followed him to the side of the aircraft. At first, I didn't understand what he was pointing at, but then I saw it, faint but unmistakable. Someone had scrawled something into the dust on the fuselage. 3 words, written with a finger. "We are here." A chill ran through me, despite the heat. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone or something watching us from the shadows. But the airfield was empty, the horizon a vast, unbroken line of sand and sky. Charlie took a shaky step back. "I'm done, Roy. I'm not touching this thing. I don't care if they court-martial me." He wasn't joking, and I couldn't blame him. But orders were orders, and we didn't have the luxury of refusing to work on a plane just because it spooked us. The next morning, I gathered a small crew and got to work. Charlie stayed away, claiming he was sick, though I knew better. The others didn't ask questions, but I could tell they felt it too. That strange, heavy presence that seemed to cling to the B-25 like a shadow. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every creak of the metal, every gust of wind set my nerves on edge. At one point, I dropped a wrench, and the sharp clang made me jump so badly I nearly fell off the wing. The other guys laughed, but it was nervous laughter, the kind that didn't reach their eyes. By the end of the day, we'd done what we could. The plane was patched up and ready to fly, though none of us were eager to see it in the air again. But the real test came that night. I was woken by the sound of engines, a deep, throaty rumble that set my teeth on edge. I stumbled out of my tent, my heart racing, and saw the B-25 sitting on the runway, its propellers spinning in the moonlight. No one was in the cockpit. No one was anywhere near it. But it was alive, its engines roaring like some kind of mechanical beast. The rest of the camp woke up too, guys spilling out of their tents and shouting over the noise. Someone yelled to cut the power, but the generators weren't running. This wasn't possible, and yet it was happening right in front of us. Then, as suddenly as it started, the engines died. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that seemed to suck all the air out of the night. No one moved. No one spoke. We just stood there, staring at the plane, waiting for something, anything to happen. Eventually, the commanding officer arrived, barking orders and demanding answers. But there were no answers. Just more questions. The B-25 was grounded indefinitely after that, left to sit at the far end of the runway like a tombstone. No one wanted to touch it, and the higher-ups seemed content to leave it alone. It became a kind of legend, a ghost story we told to new arrivals late at night. But the strangest part came a few weeks later. One of the mechanics, an old-timer named Jenkins, was going through some records when he found something that made his face go pale. He came to me and Charlie, his hands trembling as he held out a dusty logbook. "This can't be right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But it's here, plain as day." The logbook belonged to Lucky 7, the B-25 that had gone down in the desert weeks earlier. According to the records, the plane we'd been working on was hers, same serial number, same everything. But that was impossible. Lucky 7 was gone, destroyed in the crash. I'd seen the wreckage with my own eyes. Charlie stared at the logbook, then at me. "What the hell, Roy?" I didn't have an answer. I still don't. Maybe it was a clerical error. Maybe it was some kind of mix-up. Or maybe, just maybe, the desert wasn't as empty as it seemed. Maybe there was something out there, something we couldn't understand, something that refused to be forgotten. The war ended, Eventually, I went home, back to Indiana, back to a life that felt strange and small after the vastness of the desert. But I never forgot that airfield, or the planes, or the ghosts we swore we saw. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind whistles through the trees outside my house, I think I can hear it, the low, steady hum of an engine, far off in the distance, calling me back.